one of the Upanishads says that Hiranmayena Patrena Satyasa Apihita Mukham Tattung Prushanna Pabruno Satya Dharmaya Drishtaya. The truth, the face of the truth is concealed under a golden pot, inside a golden pot. O Satya Dharma, O seeker of truth and Dharma. So you look for it beyond that. And so therefore that act of concealing and moving beyond the what can be called as the natural reality of concealing. But the concealment is not our fate. In fact, in another context, Sri Aurobindo has made a critique of fatalism. And that critique of fatalism, many of the time we can look at something as it is our fate, including our journey with nature. But nature is not fate to us, but how do we transform an apparent fatalism to a creative karma? And Sri Aurobindo here tells us that there are two dimensions of self at work with us, a lower self and a higher self. And so what we can find is that in this reading, this path of the transcultural via Heraclitus and Sri Aurobindo and Su, also the great Chinese Sri Aurobindo follower. So we are invited to be engaged with the transcultural, but also in a spirit of sadhana, where the higher self, not becoming a prisoner of the hierarchy between the higher and the lower, but the higher self co-working with us in our reading, in our hermeneutics, in our philosophical journey. Another very interesting triad of, or one can look at it as the trigonometry of creativity, is reason, mysticism, and intuition. And we will see that how both Heraclitus and Sri Aurobindo, they really cultivated these three paths. And though some readers of Heraclitus, they emphasize more the rational part, but in a way the transcultural has to involve this contemporary, our own reconstruction as well as our living of reason, mysticism, and intuition. In fact, the great philosopher Jain Mohanty, commenting on Husserl, he brings this challenge of living intuition. So intuition is also very central to Sri Aurobindo's journey. So with these brief welcoming submissions, so I welcome Richard Hartz, and we are also enriched by the presence of Daniel. Namaskar, Salam, Daniel. Thank you for joining us in this pilgrimage of co-thinking. I'm sorry I wrote you at a later stage, but thank you for your generosity. And now, Richard, please.
Okay, thank you, Ananta. Actually, I had intended to make some introductory remarks on transcultural philosophy, which I think are now unnecessary because you've already said enough on that subject. So I'll get straight to my presentation because time is relatively short and there's a lot to cover. Let me share my screen. Can you see my PowerPoint presentation? The title?
Yes, we can see it, Richard. We can see it.
Okay, fine. Okay, so let me see. I'm having a little bit of, okay. Okay, this is an overview of a paper that I've written on this subject, which I'll try to condense into the time available with 6 headings: Heraclitus and the Riddle of Things, The Solitary Thinker, the ever-living fire, the one that is all, the universal reason, and the kingdom of the child. We'll see how much of this I'm able to cover in this short time. But let me begin with reading Sri Aurobindo's own introduction to his short work on Heraclitus, consisting of 7 chapters, which were published from the end of 1916 into 1917, after there had come into Sri Aurobindo's hands a small booklet by the Indian academic philosopher R.D. Ranade, who will be mentioned a few times. Sri Aurobindo was stimulated by Ranade's booklet to write his own commentary on Heraclitus. And he begins his 7 chapters with a very general statement, a balanced assessment of the relative strengths and weaknesses of ancient Greek and Indian thought. The philosophy of the Greeks is perhaps the most intellectually stimulating, the most fruitful of clarities the world has yet had. Indian philosophy was intuitive in its beginnings, stimulative rather to the deeper vision of things. When that philosophy became intellectual, precise, founded on the human reason, it became also rigidly logical, enamored of fixity and system, desirous of a sort of geometry of thought. The ancient Greek mind had instead a kind of fluid precision, a flexibly inquiring logic. Acuteness and the wide open eye of the intellect were its leading characteristics, and by this power in it, it determined the whole character and field of subsequent European thinking. Nor is any Greek thinker more directly stimulating than the aphoristic philosopher Heraclitus, and yet he keeps and adds to this more modern intellectual stimulativeness something of the antique psychic and intuitive vision and word of the older mystics. So we glimpse already the reason for Sri Aurobindo's particular interest in Heraclitus, whom he regarded as a transitional figure between mysticism and rationalism. And this brings us to the first section of my paper. Heraclitus' style, Sri Aurobindo writes, is not only aphoristic and epigrammatic, but cryptic. And this cryptic character is not merely the self-willed obscurity of an intellectual thinker affecting an excessive condensation of his thought or a too closely packed burden of suggestiveness. It is enigmatic in the style of the mystics, enigmatic in the manner of their thought, which sought to express the riddle of existence in the very language of the riddle. Now, most of what has been written about Heraclitus begins with a discussion of Heraclitus' reputation for obscurity. The epithet, the obscure, was attached to him from ancient times, and he has kept that reputation for 2,500 years. However, Heidegger, who is one of the modern philosophers who has taken a great interest in Heraclitus, comments, Heraclitus is the obscure because he thinks being as the self-concealing and must speak the word according to this thinking. In fact, Heraclitus himself says as much. Ananta referred to this. Nature loves to conceal herself is one of his memorable aphorisms. Pusis cryptas tai pile. And that the verb cryptas tai is the source of the English word cryptic, which we've seen Sri Aurobindo use in describing Heraclitus' style. Now, Ranade has a more rationalistic interpretation of Heraclitus and has commented, Heraclitus wrote in aphorisms, which is the real reason of his occasional obscurity. To take one illustration out of many, it is impossible to make out what Heraclitus meant when he called gods mortals, men and men immortals. However, Aurobindo takes issue with this and comments, but is it quite impossible if we do not cut off this thinker from the earlier thought of the mystics? The Vedic Rishi also invokes the dawn, O goddess and human. The immanence of the immortal principle in man, the descent of the gods into the workings of mortality, was almost the fundamental idea of the mystics. The gods manifest themselves as things that continually change and perish. Man is in principle an eternal being. Heraclitus' words are these: Athanatoi, tnetoi, tnetoi, athanatoi. Immortals are mortal, mortals immortal. It's interesting to note that the style of this statement is very similar to what one sometimes finds in the Upanishads, for example, in a verse from the Kena Upanishad, avijñātam vijñātam vijñātam avijñātam. The idea is a little bit different, but the structure of the verse is identical, two pairs of apparently contradictory terms. And Aurobindo points out that Heraclitus' thinking does not come down to us in large streams of subtle reasoning and opulent imagery like Plato's, but in detached aphoristic sentences aimed like arrows at truth. He has something of the mystic style, something of the intuitive Apollonian inlook into the secrets of existence. This intuitive aspect of Heraclitus' thought is commented on also by Nietzsche, who was another important modern European thinker who was fascinated by Heraclitus. Nietzsche wrote, Heraclitus' regal possession is his extraordinary power to think intuitively. Toward the other type of thinking, Nietzsche continues, the type that is accomplished in concepts and logical combinations, in other words, towards reason, he shows himself cool, insensitive, in fact hostile, and seems to feel pleasure whenever he can contradict it with an intuitively arrived at truth. Aurobindo concludes his first chapter on Heraclitus with a general statement about the place of the pre-Socratic and other Greek philosophers in the history of thought, in which he compares the development of a Greek, Indian, and other thought of the ancient world. He writes, to ignore the influence of the mystic thought and its methods of expression on the intellectual thinking of the Greeks from Pythagoras to Plato is to falsify the historical procession of the human mind. It was enveloped at first in the symbolic, intuitive, esoteric style and discipline of the mystics, Vedic and Vedantic seers, Orphic secret teachers, Egyptian priests. From that veil, it emerged along the path of a metaphysical philosophy still related to the mystics by the source of its fundamental ideas, its first aphoristic and cryptic style, its attempt to seize directly upon truth by intellectual vision rather than arrive at it by careful ratiocination, but nevertheless intellectual in its method and aim. This is the first period of the darshanas in India, in Greece, of the early intellectual thinkers. Afterwards came the full tide of philosophic rationalism, Buddha or the Buddhists and the logical philosophers in India, in Greece the sophists and Socrates with all their splendid progeny. With them, the intellectual method did not indeed begin, but came to its own and grew to its fullness. Heraclitus belongs to the transition, not to the noontide of the reason. He is even its most characteristic representative, hence his cryptic style, hence his brief and burdened thought and the difficulty we feel when we try to clarify and entirely rationalize his significance. So let's look a little bit more at what Sri Aurobindo says about Heraclitus' place in the history of thought. And I'll begin with this statement, which Sri Aurobindo made in a letter in the 1930s. Somewhere between the 7th and 5th centuries BC, men began both in the East and West to intellectualize knowledge. So Heraclitus comes right in the middle of this period, and this period is what the German philosopher Karl Jaspers referred to as the axial age. And Jaspers wrote, "An axis of world history, if such a thing exists, would be situated at the point in history most overwhelmingly fruitful in fashioning humanity. It would seem that this axis of history is to be found in the period around 500 BC, which is precisely the time when Heraclitus lived, in the spiritual process that occurred between 800 and 200 BC. For short, we may style this the axial period. The most extraordinary events are concentrated in this period. Confucius and Lao Tzu were living in China. India produced the Upanishads and Buddha. In Palestine, the prophets made their appearance. Greece witnessed the appearance of the philosophers, Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Plato. As a result of this process, hitherto unconsciously accepted ideas, customs, and conditions were subjected to examination, questioned, and liquidated. Everything was swept into the vortex. Rationality and rationally clarified experience launched a struggle against the myth, logos against mythos. And in fact, it was Heraclitus who introduced the term logos into the Greek philosophical vocabulary. And in spite of his affinity with the mystics, he does represent one. He was one of the key figures in this struggle against the mythos of what Sri Aurobindo has called the symbolic age, which preceded this age in both Greece, India, and elsewhere. Jaspers continues, the gap between the peaks of human potentiality and the crowd became exceptionally great at that time. Nonetheless, what the individual becomes indirectly changes all. The whole of humanity took a forward leap. So this role of the individual is the key in Jaspers' understanding of the axial age and also in Sri Aurobindo's analysis of the work of thinkers such as Heraclitus. A typical aphorism of Heraclitus is this one, I have sought for myself. It is the individual seeking to discover themselves, which is the key movement at this time. And likewise, Heraclitus writes, the limits of the soul you would not find out, though you should traverse every way. This is a key insight of this period of the development of ancient thought. And Heraclitus adds, to me, one is 10,000 if he be the best. It's the individual who is the key to this transition. In his book, The Human Cycle, Sri Aurobindo comments in a general way on this period where he points out that for the mass of the society as a whole, this was still an infrarational stage of development. Reason was represented by individuals, at first few, but growing in number in this period. This may well lead to an age of great individual thinkers who seize on some idea of life and its origins and laws and erect that into a philosophy of critical minds standing isolated above the mass, who judge life with power of intelligence, insight, acuteness. Heraclitus is very typical of this age of great individual thinkers, solitary thinkers, as Sri Aurobindo calls them. And this was what is called the age of pre-Socratic philosophy in Greece, which was scattered all over the Mediterranean world from Italy and Sicily to the west coast of Asia Minor. And in fact, there relatively little was happening as yet in Athens, which in the next stage of the development of Greek thought would be the focus of much of the intellectual activity of the next period. But here, Heraclitus was a native of Ephesus, one of the cities on the west coast of Asia Minor, and had relatively little, in fact, very little contact or dialogue with other philosophers of his period. Likewise, although this is an extremely simplified chart of the central ideas of the pre-Socratic philosophies, for mnemonic purposes, it's quite useful to have a more or less chronological listing of the pre-Socratic philosophers along with the fundamental principle which they chose, each of them chose to explain existence. So Heraclitus is in the middle of this list, and his idea of the arche, the fundamental principle, is fire representing change. So this brings us to the next heading, the ever-living fire, and one of Heraclitus' most famous aphorisms: no man or God has created the universe, but ever there was and is and will be the ever-living fire. But what does he mean by that? Aurobindo explains, the old Greek thinkers conceived of cosmic substance as possessed of 4 elements, omitting or not having arrived at the 5th, ether, in which Indian analysis found the first and original principle. By Indian analysis, Aurobindo is referring to the Sankhya philosophy. Sankhya means literally analysis or enumeration. In seeking the nature of the original substance, they fixed then on one or other of these 4 as the primordial nature. One, namely Anaximenes, finding it in air; another, Thales, in water, while Heraclitus, as we have seen, describes or symbolizes the source and reality of all things as an ever-living fire. The distinction of Heraclitus among the early Greek sages is his conception of the upward and downward road, one and the same in the descent and the return. Hodos ano kato mia kai houte. It corresponds to the Indian idea of nivritti and pravritti, the double movement of the soul and nature. Pravritti, the moving out and forward; nivritti, the moving back and in. Out of fire, the radiant and energetic principle, air, water, and earth proceed. That is the procession of energy on its downward road. There is equally in the very tension of this process a force of potential return, which would lead things backward to their source in the reverse order. In the balance of these 2 upward and downward forces resides the whole cosmic action. Everything is a poise of contrary energies. The movement of life is like the back returning of the bow, to which he compares it. Every force of action compensated by a corresponding force of reaction. By the resistance of one to the other, all the harmonies of existence are created. This is a quotation from the Tao Te Ching, which belongs to roughly the same period, and the parallel between Heraclitus' use of the image of the bow and the use of the same image in the Tao Te Ching was pointed out by the Chinese scholar Shufang Cheng, who translated Aurobindo essays on Heraclitus and added his own quite extensive Chinese commentary. The way of heaven, is it not like the stretching of a bow? What is high, it presses down. What is low, it lifts up. It takes from what has excess. It augments what is deficient. Aurobindo points out Heraclitus has clearly an idea of something more than a physical substance or energy in his concept of the ever-living fire. Fire is to him the physical aspect, as it were, of a great burning, creative, formative, and destructive force, the sum of all whose processes is a constant and unceasing change. The idea of the one which is eternally becoming many, and the many which is eternally becoming one, and of that one, therefore, not so much as stable substance or essence, as active force, a sort of substantial will to become, is the foundation of Heraclitus' philosophy. The Upanishad, too, describes the cosmos as a universal motion and becoming. It is all this that is mobile in the mobility, jagatyam jagat, the very word for universe, jagat, which is used in the first verse of the Isha Upanishad, having the radical sense of motion, so that the whole universe, the macrocosm, is one vast principle of motion and therefore of change and instability, while each thing in the universe is in itself a microcosm of the same motion and instability. The relation between God and world is summed up in the phrase, "It is he that has moved out everywhere," saparyagat. This is also the Isha Upanishad. He is the Lord, the seer and thinker, who becoming everywhere, paribhu. Heraclitus Logos, his Zeus, his one out of which come all things, has fixed all things rightly according to their nature from years sempiternal. Heraclitus, all things are fixed and determined. Substitute his fire for the Vedantic Atman, and there is nothing in the expressions of the Upanishad which the Greek thinker would not have accepted as another figure of his own thought. And do not the Upanishads use, among other images, this very symbol of the fire? Agniryataiko bhuvanam pravishto rupam rupam pratirupo babhuva ekas tatha sarvabhutantaratma rupam rupam pratirupo bhavishcha. Even as one fire has entered into the world, but it shapes itself to the forms it meets, so there is one spirit within all creatures, but it shapes itself to form and form. It is likewise outside all these. From the Katha Upanishad. Heraclitus, Aurobindo points out, tells us precisely the same thing. God, hotheos, is the Greek, the word for God, is all contraries. He takes various shapes, just as fire, when it is mingled with spices, is named according to the savor of each. Each one names him according to his pleasure, says the Greek seer, and he accepts all names and yet accepts none, not even the highest name of Zeus. He consents and yet at the same time does not consent to be called by the name of Zeus. Aurobindo translates one of Heraclitus' aphorisms. So too said the Indian Dirghatamas of old in his long hymn of the divine mysteries in the Rig Veda, one existent, the sages called by many names, Ekam Sad Vipra Bahudha Vadanti. So we come now to the central section of my presentation, where Aurobindo asks, what precisely is the keynote of Heraclitus' thinking? Where has he found his starting point, or what are the grand lines of his philosophy? As in Indian, so in Greek philosophy, the first question for thought was the problem of the one and the many. We see everywhere a multiplicity of things and beings. Is it real or only phenomenal or practical? Maya, vyavahara. Does unity exist at all? And if so, is it a unity of sum or of primordial principle, a result or an origin, a oneness of totality or a oneness of nature or a oneness of essence? The various standpoints of pluralism, of Sankhya, of Vedanta. The Veda itself speaks of that one. In this verse, Dashashata Sahatastus Tadekam. There the 10 hundreds stand still together, that one. This is a verse in the Rig Veda, which the Isha Upanishad paraphrases in the verse about the golden lid covering the face of the truth, which Ananta referred to in his introduction. The 10 hundreds and that one are in the Veda both real. And Sri Aurobindo likewise, in his own philosophy, describes the relationship of the one and the many in very similar terms. In the chapters, the central chapters of the first book of his philosophical magnum opus, The Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo writes, above the formula of the one eternally stable and immutable, below the formula of the many, which eternally mutable seeks but hardly finds in the flux of things a firm and immutable standing point. Between the seat of all that becomes many in one and yet remains one in many because it was originally one that is always potentially many. It has the knowledge of the one, but is able to draw out of the one its hidden multitudes. It manifests the many, but does not lose itself in their differentiations. The last sentence is one of the best definitions Sri Aurobindo has given of what he calls in his own philosophy the supermind, and he relates this to the Vedantic term vijnana. He also connects these ideas with the two apothegms of Heraclitus, which according to Sri Aurobindo give us the starting point of his whole thinking. They are his saying that it is wisdom to admit that all things are one, and his other saying, one out of all and all out of one. The second phrase is particularly interesting because structurally it's very similar to this formula at the end of the passage that I just read from The Life Divine, where Sri Aurobindo gives his explanation of what he means by the supermind, one out of all and all out of one. Must we read them into each other and conclude that for Heraclitus, the one only exists as a resultant of the many, even as the many only exist as a becoming of the one? Mr. Ranade seems to think so. He tells us that this philosophy denies being and affirms only becoming, like Nietzsche, like the Buddhists. In fact, this was Nietzsche's interpretation of Heraclitus. Nietzsche writes, he altogether denied being. For this one world nowhere shows a tarrying, an indestructibility, a bulwark in the stream. Louder than Anaximander, Heraclitus proclaimed, I see nothing other than becoming. However, Sri Aurobindo takes issue with this and comments, but surely this is to read a little too much into Heraclitus' theory of perpetual change, to take it too much by itself. If that was his whole belief, it is difficult to see why he should seek for an original and eternal principle, the ever-living fire, which creates all by its perpetual changing, governs all by its fiery force of the thunderbolt. Nietzsche, whom Mr. Ranade rightly affiliates to Heraclitus, Nietzsche, the most vivid, concrete, and suggestive of modern thinkers, as is Heraclitus among the early Greeks, founded his whole philosophical thought on this conception of existence as a vast will to become and of the world as a play of force. But he affirms becoming only and excludes being from his view of things. Hence, his philosophy is in the end unsatisfactory, insufficient, lopsided. It stimulates, but solves nothing. Heraclitus does not exclude being from the data of the problem of existence, although he will not make any opposition or gulf between that and becoming. His conception of existence as at once one and many, by his conception, he is bound to accept these two aspects of his ever-living fire as simultaneously true in each other. Being is an eternal becoming, and yet the becoming resolves itself into eternal being. All is in flux, for all is change of becoming. We cannot step into the same waters twice, for it is other and yet other waters that are flowing on. And yet, with his keen eye on the truth of things, preoccupied though he was with this aspect of existence, he could not help seeing another truth behind it. There's another aphorism of Heraclitus, less often quoted, but more characteristic of the paradoxical insights of Heraclitus. The waters into which we step are and are not the same. We are and we are not. Heraclitus does not solve the contradiction. He states it in his own way, and in his own way tries to give some account of its process. So we come now to the Logos, the universal reason. But first of all, Sri Aurobindo gives quite a lot of attention to an aphorism that seems to refer to the very opposite of a universal reason. His statement, war is the father and king of all. And in Sri Aurobindo's essays on the Gita, in a chapter which incidentally he wrote and published in exactly the same month as he began his series on Heraclitus, Sri Aurobindo writes, "War, said Heraclitus, is the father of all things. War is the king of all," and the saying, like most of the apothegms of the Greek thinker, suggests a profound truth. From a clash of material or other forces, everything in this world, if not the world itself, seems to be born by a struggle of forces, tendencies, principles, beings. It seems to proceed, ever creating new things, ever destroying the old, marching one knows not very well whither, to a final self-destruction, say some, in an unending series of vain cycles, say others, in progressive cycles is the most optimistic conclusion, leading through whatever trouble and apparent confusion towards a higher and higher approximation to some divine apocalypse. The last option is in fact Sri Aurobindo's own position, these progressive cycles. But there is another side to the thought of Heraclitus. He says indeed that all things come into being according to strife, by the clash of forces, are governed by the determining justice of war, but also all things come into being according to reason, kat erin, but also kataton logon. And one of his aphorisms, which Sri Aurobindo also already referred to in part, is this: "It is wise for those who hear not me but the universal reason to confess that all things are one." The universal reason is the translator's equivalent of logos, and a frequently adopted translation of logos, which agrees with Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. Sri Aurobindo writes, "What is this logos? It is not an inconscient reason in things, for his fire is not merely an inconscient force. It is Zeus and eternity. Fire, Zeus, is force, but it is also an intelligence. Let us say then that it is an intelligent force which is the origin and master of things. Nor can this logos be identical in its nature with the human reason, for that is an individual and therefore relative and partial judgment and intelligence which can only seize on relative truth, not on the true truth of things. But the logos is one and universal, an absolute reason, therefore, combining and managing all the relativities of the many." Now, what is interesting in relation to this term logos is that Sri Aurobindo adopted it himself, not only in writings of comparative philosophy, as in the case of Heraclitus, but also at the very heart of his own, the books which contain his own spiritual teaching and method of practice, particularly the Synthesis of Yoga, where he writes, "The infinite, we may say, organizes by the power of its self-knowledge the law of its own manifestation of being in the universe. The intelligence, to give it an inadequate name, the logos that thus organizes its own manifestation, is evidently something infinitely greater, more extended in knowledge, compelling in self-power than the mental intelligence, which is to us the highest realized degree and expression of consciousness." the Godhead of the reason, the intellectual logos, is only a partial representative and substitute for the greater supramental logos, and its function is to impose a preliminary partial knowledge and order upon the life of the creature. But the real, final, and integral order can only be founded by the spiritual supermind in its emergence. Where is the principle that bridges the gulf between the pure and the figured Brahman, Nirguna and Saguna Brahman? Or what power of consciousness enables the formless to pour itself into forms? It is, says Vedanta, a special principle, a selective power of pure consciousness which all being possesses, the principle, the faculty of Vijnana. Vijnana is indeed a consciousness which sees things not as the human reason sees them, in parts and pieces, in separated and aggregated relations, but in the original reason of their existence and law of their existence, their primal and total truth. Therefore, it is the seed logos, the originative and determinate conscious force working as supreme intelligence and will. So in his transcultural philosophy and method of spiritual practice, Sri Aurobindo adopts this Greek term even in discussing the central ideas of his fundamentally Indian system. Now, I have one relatively short section, and I think I should be able to take, can I take time just to finish?
Yes, please.
Okay. The kingdom of the child. Here, I want to make a brief comparison again with Nietzsche and Heidegger in their interpretations of Heraclitus, comparing them with Sri Aurobindo's. And to begin with Nietzsche, Nietzsche writes, "Do guilt, injustice, contradiction, and suffering exist in this world? They do," proclaims Heraclitus, "but only for the limited human mind which sees things apart and not connected. In this world only play as artists and children engage in it, exhibits coming to be and passing away, structuring and destroying without any moral additive, in forever equal innocence. And as children and artists play, so plays the ever-living fire. Transforming itself into water and earth, it builds towers of sand like a child at the seashore, piles them up and tramples them down." Likewise, Heidegger, as summarized in a book by John Caputo, The Mystical Element in Heidegger's Thought, refers to the aphorism of Heraclitus, which Nietzsche also alludes to. What Heraclitus called logos, he also called by other names: physis, that which emerges from out of itself; cosmos, the ordered totality of all things; and finally aion, which is usually translated as world time. Now let us see what Heraclitus has to say about aion. Time, aion, is a child playing a game of drafts. The kingship is in the hands of a child. Sri Aurobindo translates this even more literally. The Greek reads paidos he basileia, which means literally the kingdom is of the child, as Sri Aurobindo translates it. And around the same time that Sri Aurobindo wrote his essays on Heraclitus, he wrote a poem in Bengali called Mahakal, which I've translated, and I'll read the concluding passage of this poem because it refers to exactly the same image of the child, this cosmic child, who on this earth is strong and free enough to be a partner in your game, your game addressing time, Aion, Mahakal in Bengali, to be a partner in your game, partake your thrill when you create, when you destroy. Pity and laughter mingle as you gaze upon your creatures. So a poet views his work and relishes its happy scenes and tragic. with the same artistic joy. But you, O beautiful and dreadful God, laugh ceaselessly with an unbounded mirth, creating and dissolving worlds in sport, moved by an overpowering rapture's urge that wells from your unfathomable heart. You sit and play, O child, O Lord of time. We don't know whether Sri Aurobindo was directly inspired by Heraclitus' phrase, the kingdom of the child, when he wrote these lines around the same time in Bengali, but the idea is very much along the same lines. Now, to conclude, in the last section of his essays on Heraclitus, the seventh essay, Sri Aurobindo points out that the significance of this aphorism on the child points beyond otherwise what one would have to say were certain limitations of Heraclitus thought and of Greek and Western thought in general. He writes, "Force by itself can only produce a balance of forces, the strife that is justice. In that strife, there takes place a constant exchange. And once this exchange is seen, there arises the possibility of modifying and replacing war by reason as the determinant principle of the exchange." This is how Sri Aurobindo reconciles Heraclitus's apparently contradictory aphorisms on war and on logos. From exchange, we can rise to the highest possible idea of interchange, a mutual dependency of self-giving as the hidden secret of life. From that can grow the power of love, replacing strife and exceeding the cold balance of reason. So there are three stages. Heraclitus clearly saw two. He only hints at this last stage. There is the gate of the divine ecstasy, Sri Aurobindo writes. Heraclitus could not see it, and yet his one saying about the kingdom of the child touches, almost reaches the heart of the secret. The heart of the secret has to do with what in India is called lila, the idea of the play, which, as we've seen, struck both Nietzsche and Heidegger also when they singled out this aphorism on the kingdom of the child for special comment. Sri Aurobindo explains lila in The Life Divine. If we look at world existence in its relation to the self-delight of eternally existent being, Ananda, in other words, we may regard, describe, and realize it as lila, the play, the child's joy, the poet's joy, the actor's joy, the mechanician's joy of the soul of things, eternally young, perpetually inexhaustible, creating and recreating himself in himself for the sheer bliss of that self-creation, of that self-representation. Himself the play, himself the player, himself the playground. Just one final sentence from Sri Aurobindo's essays on Heraclitus. He introduces his concluding reflections with this sentence: "We see in how many directions the deep divining eye of Heraclitus anticipated the largest and profoundest generalizations of science and philosophy, and how even his more superficial thoughts indicate later powerful tendencies of the Occidental mind, how too some of his ideas influenced such profound and fruitful thinkers as Plato, the Stoics, and the Neoplatonists." And this influence continues in Heraclitus' influence on modern 19th and 20th century thinkers such as Nietzsche and Heraclitus. Hardly understood by his contemporaries, Heraclitus speaks to us today across barriers of language and culture. More than ever, his words have the power to elicit the kind of transcultural reflections Sri Aurobindo evidently intended to stimulate through his essays on this remarkable thinker. So I'll conclude my presentation with these remarks. And Ananta, do you want to introduce? You are going to have Daniel make some concluding remarks.
Some intermediate remarks, and then we are gifted by the presence of Ori and Benedetta. Welcome, Benedetta. Merci beaucoup. And so with our mutual generosity, we'll have a little more time. We'll listen to these friends, if it is okay. So we'll, with our generosity, we'll flow together with Heraclitus, Sri Aurobindo, Nietzsche, and this fascinating invitation, the kingdom of the child. And with Benedetta's presence, I'm reminded of the great immortal work of Exupéry, The Little Prince, and his wisdom of the sand, how where the king is reflecting upon this deep set of reflections. And of course, not to forget one of the realizations of Sri Aurobindo is that God is the eternally child playing. And Nietzsche also has some very deep thoughts about the idea of kingdom of God and all these things. And when we are listening to Richard, among many gifts, what we also find, the simultaneous sadhana of history, philosophy, and sadhana. That when when Sri Aurobindo is reflecting on Heraclitus, it is really an invitation to history, but a history which is not frozen, a history which is unfolding as part of our sadhana. So now, Daniel, please. Daniel.
Okay. Good afternoon from Tel Aviv. Thank you, Richard, for this paper. So I'm sitting here. I'm sitting here all alone on the fourth floor of the Gilman Building of Humanities in Tel Aviv University. Our academic year, some of you would know, is postponed because of the war. War is the father and king of all. Richard just quoted Heraclitus. Yesterday I participated in an event with the families of 129 hostages kidnapped by the Hamas from their beds, from their homes, children, women, men. For the last 7 weeks, they are held, hopefully alive, in the tunnels of the Hamas in Gaza. The so-called leaders of all sides do not seem to care. 129 people, and our heart is totally broken. This is one reason for the broken heart. So I'm joining you today, not because everything is as usual, but despite the fact that nothing is as usual. Ananta was kind to invite me, and he sent me Richard's paper this morning, and I read it quickly, and I wrote something in response, something short in response, writing as a form of reading, right? So just a few points apropos Richard's beautiful paper I'm reading from my computer. Richard opened with the riddle of all things, as he puts it, with Aurobindo's work, The Riddle of the World, reverberating in the background. I'm reminded here of Milan Kundera, the Czech novelist. In an interview appended to the Book of Laughter and Forgetting, Kundera writes, "When Don Quixote went out into the world, that world turned into a mystery before his eyes. That is the legacy of the first European novel to the entire subsequent history of the novel. The novel teaches us to comprehend the world as a question. There is wisdom and tolerance in that attitude. The world as a mystery, as a riddle, as an open question." This is what I wrote. "The power of the riddle remains even when it is allegedly solved. There is something perennial about riddles and questions, something tentative about solutions and answers. Kundera speaks of a questioning attitude which conveys a sense of tolerance. and freedom, I would add. And then Aurobindo's remark that, quote, the enigmatic style of mystics is their way to express the riddle of existence in the very language of the riddle. In the same way, I would add, silence is often used in the Upanishads to point at the ineffable. In his commentary on Brahma Sutra 3-17, Shankara tells the story of sage Bhadava, who is asked by a disciple on the Brahman and remains silent. When asked again and again, he replies, I'm teaching you, but you are not listening. Silent is the Atman. Upashanto ayam atmeti. Next, in Richard's paper, is the transition from ancient to modern languages and ways of expression. According to Aurobindo, I'm relying on the secret of the Veda, in ancient languages, the signification was not a matter of one-to-one function. Moreover, Aurobindo suggests that something is lost in the precise signification of modern languages. Certain openness, flexibility, and the capacity to bear, as he puts it, multiple meanings simultaneously. So all this is abandoned in the transition to modern languages. A certain magic was lost, if I may use two classical Sanskrit notions, when Vyanjana was replaced with Abhidha. Vyanjana and Abhidha. Abhidha, Mukundlat, a contemporary theorist, explains, is denotative, indicative meaning, and Vyanjana may be characterized as evocative. The significance of Vyanjana, that which is lost according to Sri Aurobindo, lies in a meaning which is addressed not to our intellect, but to our emotive, felt consciousness. Hartz's depiction of Abhidha echoes Aurobindo, who in The Secret of the Veda further writes, in the first state of language, the word is a living, or even more living force than its idea. Sound determines sense. In its last state, in modern languages, the positions have been reversed. The idea becomes all important, the sound secondary. Number 3, next, Richard quotes Heidegger, who says that there is no philosophy other than Occidental philosophy. I think that even today, Western philosophy is rarely interested in voices from the non-West, particularly if it is a critique based on texts, frames, and presuppositions which are beyond the comfort zone of the Western canon. My fourth point, I have 7. Then Heraclitus and Aurobindo on mortal gods, immortal humans. Heraclitus's remark really makes sense if seen in the mirror of Indian philosophy. So many gods in the Indian mythology, but it is the human being which stands at the center. In Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 1.4.10, it is said that whoever knows that he is Brahman, the whole, becomes this very whole. Sa'idam sarvam bhavati. I'm only quoting because Richard is quoting from Sanskrit and Greek, so this is my response. Sa'idam sarvam bhavati. This is so, the Upanishadic author suggests, with regards to gods, rishis, and humans. The distinction between the rishi, the seer, if you wish, and the ordinary human being, Manushya, is noteworthy. A few lines down the road, the author of the Upanishad explains, as livestock is for man, so is he for the gods. As having a lot of livestock is useful for a man, so each man proves useful to the gods. The loss of even a single head of livestock is painful. How much more if many are lost? The gods, therefore, are not pleased at the prospect of man coming to understand this. The human person I'm writing for the gods is of the same value as livestock is for him, or for them, for the gods. They own him. No, sorry. The human person is for the gods is for the gods of the same value as livestock is for him, for the human being. They own him. The gods own the human person. He is useful to them. Hence, they do not want to lose him in the same way that he wishes to maintain his livestock. If he comes to know and to become the whole, the gods will lose him. But even they cannot prevent it. I'm talking about about the human being at the center, despite the number of gods in the Indian mythology. They cannot prevent the redemption of the human being from his fragmented existence to become the whole. Here there are close similarities with Plato's Symposium, which I don't have the time to touch. My fifth point, Heraclitus. I'm saying Heraclitus in the Hebrew, which is closer to the Greek pronunciation. Heraclitus and Aurobindo. Aurobindo addresses Heraclitus as a solitary thinker, but in fact thinks of himself as such. Don't you think so, Richard?
Yeah.
And then Heraclitus and the fire, and Aurobindo's own translations of the hymns to fire, Agni, from the third mandala of the Rig Veda, and Aurobindo's beautiful phrase that Richard highlights, the everlasting fire. Aurobindo interprets Heraclitus from and through his own experience. But this is no accusation. Aurobindo might be accused, Richard writes, of reading the philosophy of Vedanta or his own into that of Heraclitus. This is what we do all the time. I understand the text better, Daya Krishna writes. Daya Krishna, one of the most interesting voices in Indian philosophy in the second half of the 20th century. I understand the text better, Daya Krishna writes, in his essay Thinking versus Thought from 1988, when I ask myself, what is this person the author is trying to do? I make the text my own. I get into his work, into his thought process, and carry it in a direction where it was not taken. Sorry for that. Number 6, the kingdom of the child. The kingdom of the child. Sorry. This section in Richard's paper takes me into the 3 metamorphoses. The first speech of Zarathustra in Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. Here the spirit transforms first into a camel, then into a lion, and finally into a child. The camel or camelness is an illustration of the heavyweight burden of the day-in, day-outness of the human situation, what classical Indian philosophy usually refers to as dukkha. The lion stands for what Nietzsche refers to as holy name, the capacity of facing the great dragon of old values, Yama, or Yama's double in my reading. And counteract, the lion can counteract the old dragon's thou shalt with I will. And the notion of willing, by the way, is central in Savitri, right? When she faces Yama, she tells him, oh, death who reasonest, I reason not. Again, I'm quoting because Richard is quoting. Oh, death who reasonest, I reason not. And then she says, I something, I am, I will. So Nietzsche, thou shalt transforms to I will in the stage of the lion. The child is the most interesting symbol, as Richard showed. But tell me, my brethren, Zarathustra, in Thomas Common's translation, asks, what the child can do, which even the lion could not do. What hath the praying lion still? Why hath the praying lion still to become a child? And he answers, innocence is the child, and forgetfulness, a new beginning, a game. This corresponds with Lila that Richard spoke about, a self-rolling wheel, a first movement, a holy yea. For the game of creating, my brethren, there is needed a holy yea unto life. It was Richard, no other than Richard, who showed me that Aurobindo himself refers to Nietzsche's The Three Metamorphoses in his essays on the Gita. Finally, 7, finally, the river. Heraclitus is often interpreted as a Buddhist. Nothing is solid, eternal, or fixed. On the contrary, everything is moving, changing. You cannot step into the same river twice, since it will not be the same river and the same you. And Cratylus adds, not even once, since the river and you change momentarily, even as you cross the river. But the twist which Aurobindo points at is that the situation is more complex and interesting. The river is and is not the same simultaneously. How come? Here I would read Mukund Lat's essay, Identity Through Necessary Change from 2003. Identity, Mukund suggests, is usually understood as something which remains the same despite change. However, he continues to write, there are identities where difference is not contingent, but necessary to identity. Identity in such cases is formed and maintained through a process of change. This identity not only accommodates, but also invites change and plurality. Mukund's case study in his inquiry into identity through necessary change is classical Indian music, raga music. In raga, he explains, we have an enticing case of identity where the raga is necessarily formulated through a process of palpable self-conscious change called alap. Here, identity is the result of a necessary process of alap-like change, a change that aims at creating an identity. This identity cannot be imagined without change. Now I wrote it is 5 to 2. I joined you at 2 o'clock Israel time. I didn't have time to continue. The river illustration is all about identity, which is constantly changing, but consists of certain identity or selfhood, sustained not despite change, but through creative improvisation, like Aurobindo's Brahman, I wish to argue. ... to be continued.
Thank you, Todaroba, Daniel, for your gift, and my and our heart is with the pain and suffering of the hostages, including many who are being killed. So with this meditation, let us hope that, as Sri Aurobindo says, that to replace war and reason with love, that is our journey with the kingdom of the child. So now I invite Professor Ori J. Soltes, who is himself also a deep, if I may put, a deep sadhaka with transcultural philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, Indian wisdom tradition, and many contemporary movements of thought, including movements for social transformations like his study of the Hizmet movement. So Ori, please.
Well, unlike you, Danielle, I did not see anything or hear anything until I signed on. And I was not expecting to respond, but I'm happy to make a comment that occurred to me, particularly regarding the later part of Richard's remarks, having to do with the discussion of time as a child playing. And of course, it occurs to me that the thing about that idea, that image, is that whereas we can speak of ourselves as having moral codes, so we're moral, we're immoral, we speak of good and evil, we, at one theoretical level, think of children as pre-moral, so we think of them as amoral. They don't have a moral code. So they play, and they're not thinking necessarily about good and evil or the consequences of what they're doing. So if one thinks of the principle underlying the universe as a child at play, so the principle underlying the universe is one that is essentially amoral, right? It just is. And on the one hand, of course, I think back to the earlier Greek concept of Moira and Plato's transformation of that to the idea of the forms that they just are. and everything that we are and everything that we do, to a certain extent, participates in what the forms are, but the forms simply are. And that's his conviction. And my mind sort of fast forwarded to the way in which this concept enters all the way forward into popular culture, where, and the two examples that jumped into my mind, and forgive me, because I always find with my students whom I expect to know something about popular culture that they don't, particularly if it's not their generation. So the two examples that jump into my head are, one, if you are, which you may not be, familiar with Superman comic books, a creation of the last, 60, 70, 80 years, there is a character who periodically appears in the Superman comics, and he comes from another reality, another dimension. And somehow the phraseology is there is a tear in the dimension wall, and he enters our reality. And he's got the kind of powers that he can make all kinds of things happen, but absolutely no sense of how they actually affect us. So it just seems fun to him to suddenly create a flood that engulfs the East Coast cities, let's say, of the United States. And it's not that he's trying to be destructive. He has no concept of what that means. And the challenge, of course, for Superman is to get rid of this character. And the formula, the ritual, is he has to trick him. His name is made up of a whole series of consonants. And he has to trick him into saying his own name backwards. That's the formula. And then he's gone. But the character is absolutely ambiguous. It's not positive, not negative. It just has these powers that can affect us with no concept. And then I thought, in the television series of 25 years ago, Star Trek, there's a character who occasionally makes an appearance. He's called Q, as in the letter Q. And similarly conceived, he's got all power. He's treated almost as if he's God, can do anything. But what he does is neither with benevolent nor malevolent intention. It's simply, it's kind of fun, so he does it. And so the Star Trek heroes are struggling with ways to kind of get him out of the situation, out of their situation for a while. So it just occurs to me that, one can see this all as a child at play, but as the one becomes many, and the many is within the one, and the one is within the many, that concept has a rather interesting array, a myriad of manifestations in thought, of which, on the one hand, you've got this heavy laden concept of Moira. Zeus himself cannot save the life of his son Sarpedon in book 16 of the Iliad, because it is Sarpedon's Moira, his fate, that he perish now on this day at the hands of Patroclus. That kind of gravitas, all the way to this concept of Q in Star Trek, that ultimately are part of the many more than I've exemplified, of course, many more of the many that can come out of this one concept, which it's just what popped into my head as a response. There are many, many other things, of course, along the way of your talk, and Daniel hit so many of them so well that they don't require comment. But this just occurred to me, I guess, in the mood of play, indeed, and certainly in today's world, and the one in which we all sit, and the one in which Daniel particularly sits right now. I suppose it's not a bad thing to be reminded of play as something that can be lighthearted, and not just something which is so heavy, because the world is so heavy right now.
Thank you, Ori. Again, Todorova. Now, Benedetta, please.
Hello, thank you so much. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Ananta. Thank you, Daniel. First of all, it's really wonderful to have a new chapter of a sort of never-ending conversation, an entretien infini, Blanchot would say, about Aurobindo, Heraclitus, and transcultural philosophy. we've been meeting around this topic in Tel Aviv with Daniel, who kindly invited me there, and also in Paris more recently this year. And before, these essays on Heraclitus have been the first text I've been reading by Sri Aurobindo, the first text to have been handed to me, and also the first text I've been lecturing on in India. It took a bit of courage. On Heraclitus, I was more at ease, but on Aurobindo, it was my kind of beginning. So I have the feeling every time I have this opportunity to hear more from these colleagues or to go over this text again, I'm learning more from these 7 little essays. It's a minor production, and indeed it's a sort of jewel, I have the feeling, and that tells a lot about the importance in Sri Aurobindo, first of all, of a peculiar take on transcultural philosophy. I will try to say a few words on this, but also about the importance of hermeneutics in Sri Aurobindo's work, and the philosophy of history, which is deeply, deeply rooted in the appreciation of language. And so these logos we've been hearing about, it's important, I believe, to remember that in this, we translate and compare so easily, but the logos is a word that has to do with the spoken word, somehow points to the mantra, maybe, if I can dare pronouncing a Sanskrit word. And while rationality has rather to do with calculation, with measure, so takes us into a completely different way. And somehow I have the feeling that Sri Aurobindo gives so much importance to Heraclitus because he sees him as the philosopher who's historically sitting on this transition. And so today I just would like to share with you some reflection about the word paradox that came to my mind hearing the beautiful paper offered by Richard. Sorry, Ananta, I joined you a few minutes late. I'm a bit sick, so I was in a slow pace. So I have the feeling, hearing Richard today, going again through these 7 little pearls, that Heraclitus is the philosopher Sri Aurobindo sees as historically sitting in this big flow of the evolution of consciousness, which is witnessed by the evolution of languages, as the thinker transitioning in between the mystic and ratio, in between intuition and logos. And so as this peculiar function of being like Janus, the god who had 2 faces in the Latin word, Heraclitus is sitting in between these 2 ages, so has a face turned to intuition and mystic, and another towards logos and rationality. And in this he embodies this rhetoric figure of paradox. Paradox literally means 2 opinions sitting beside one another, coexisting. And this is exactly in Sri Aurobindo's reading the gift Heraclitus gives to humanity, the reason why he is interesting. So the reason why he's been writing so many centuries ago and we still read it, because in this transition he still carries the seed of the capacity of keeping together 2 visions, the one and the many, the river being the same and not the same. And so in this philosophy has the seed of vijnana, of supermind, of being beyond mind as the appreciation of the difference, of this phase of the evolution of consciousness where we still need to sit with contraries. We still need to say that if white, not black. And In this, I have the feeling Sri Aurobindo, talking through Heraclitus, talking about Heraclitus, seizes two paradoxes in history and philosophy. One is that this evolution of consciousness paradoxically happens through cultures. So we can compare different cultures, different expression of this human logos, this human potential, because in different cultural settings, climates, they've been undergoing like the same wave. This is the vision Sri Aurobindo seems to suggest. I don't know if it's the most contemporary part, the most interesting, as Sri Aurobindo teaches us to take from the past philosopher what is interesting. The essays start saying Heraclitus is interesting. So I don't know if this paradox, so basically humanity is one being, his rationality evolves into a continuous flow. So different ages can be compared because, around the 5th centuries before Christ, there was this shift. So we can have them meeting, comparing times, though they were very disparate, no? The Vedic and the Upanishad rather chronologically, and Heraclitus. I don't know if this is the most interesting. I don't know if, like Jaspers, we are still ready to say that humanity undergoes ages like Hegel. This is a totally Hegelian scenario. I've been struck by hearing Aurobindo defining logos as absolute reason, though I've been reading this text many times. Thanks, Richard, I realized, okay, this is Hegel appearing, amongst the lines. But still there is a beautiful way in which Aurobindo triggers this Hegelian scenario. I don't know if it's if it's ours anymore, because there are individuals that somehow anticipate and create whirlpools in this apparently homogenic march of reason towards, beyond mind and beyond. And these are exactly these solitary individuals who write and read. This is still us. Look, it's like the Russian dolls. We are here reading Aurobindo, reading Heraclitus, but at the same time, it's undeniable. Aurobindo is influenced by Nietzsche. So Aurobindo reading Nietzsche, this is like Russian dolls of history hermeneutics, of philology, and we are still here. And we are alone when we do this. Like Heraclitus, Daniel also was saying this is solitary, the solitary thinker, finally the solitary rishi, right? Anticipating. So alone because anticipating, a mutant in my own words. The second paradox, this was the paradox of different civilization meeting in time. It's a temporal, a chronological chronological paradox. So it's only looking back to Heraclitus that we can understand where we are heading to in this perspective offered by Sri Aurobindo. Heraclitus is a cosmo-historic individual, Hegel would say, in the evolution of consciousness, leading from mysticism to rationality, and so amphibious, hybrid, being capable of carrying these two potentials of the human wealth, which are understood in the rational age as contradictory. He's a mutant, so in this transition he can still carry both, and doing this he's able to say that the one is the all and the river is and not, so is capable of carrying a paradoxical reason. So a reason beyond mind, a reason beyond rationality. So he lives in the past, but he anticipates our journey towards an overmind, maybe I would say, if not yet a supermind, an overmind, capable of standing with the contraries. And doing so, I think Aurobindo teaches us something very important, which is that transculturality is not only to do with spaces, with cultural differences, with areas. It has to do with time. It's different culture, that of the past. So it's also a different culture that we are looking for to come in the future. And I think in this, Aurobindo is extremely stimulating, as Heraclitus was to us. And maybe also he teaches us, as for him, Heraclitus teaches us about this historical transition in those centuries in Greece. Maybe through Aurobindo, we can also understand something of this crucial transition that happens in between 19th and 20th century. Thank you very much.
So merci beaucoup and gracia. Thank you, Benedetta. And again, I'm grateful to all the participants for our generosity of co-presence. We'll have a little more time. So now let us listen to Gyan Luigi, please, who also has been a deep scholar of Plato and Bhagavad Gita and Indian philosophical traditions. Gyan Luigi, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was really very interesting. And of course, there are very many themes to be discussed on and to be analyzed, to be inquired into. It is difficult now to make a choice. I would say, well, Heraclitus has suffered, so to speak, of which, what in my opinion is a misunderstanding. That is the attempt to reduce it, to reduce his thought to a thought of reality as becoming, as continuous becoming. And I do not agree with this interpretation personally, but I must admit that the two thinkers who have thought that Heraclitus should be interpreted that way are nothing else and nothing less than Plato and Aristotle. Because Plato in the Theaetetus and Aristotle in many passages of the Metaphysics, for instance, when he tries to defend the principle of contradiction, or where he reconstructs the thought of Plato, of the beginning of Plato. Well, both of them, they say that Heraclitus is the thinker of the Pantarei, of everything is becoming, is going, is flowing away, no stability. I personally do not agree with this interpretation, as said, because I see that in Heraclitus we have something else, and I think that Aurobindo is perfectly right when he says that there is the one who has an infinity of manifestations, but without confounding and losing himself in these continuous manifestations. I think also that Aurobindo is perfectly right when he insists on, if I'm not mistaken, when he insists that Heraclitus has deeply influenced the thought of the Stoics, for instance, because the nous of the Stoics is a nous with continuous manifestations, and with the precise rule and law or rationality in their reality. And of course, Heraclitus has then influenced also many aspects of Neoplatonism. Now, I was thinking, for instance, of this passage of Aurobindo when he says that the one has the manifestations, and well, I must say that I find some analogies with a passage which is in Nicolaus of Cues, So in the Renaissance, Nicolaus, of course, is deeply bound to Neoplatonism. Therefore, it is not an accident that we find something which is so similar to positions of Sri Aurobindo and to positions of Heraclitus in a philosopher of the Renaissance. I would say so, and of course, I think that Heraclitus has deep analogies with all the interpretations of Advaita Vedanta. That is, with all interpretation which do not see a dualism in the Indian philosophy. This for sure. What perhaps also with the Katha Upanishad, of course, with the mentioned passage of the Katha Upanishad. Perhaps I do not know. I think that there are also passages in Plato, for instance, which, so to speak, could function as a completion of some interpretations of the Upanishads, where, for instance, the Upanishad, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, says, "Bring me from the darkness to the light, from the untruth to the truth, from not being to the being." I think that in this context, perhaps Plato is more similar than Heraclitus to some positions of Indian philosophy. Then there are, of course, very many analogies between Plato and positions of Indian philosophy. In my opinion, that one which is most impressive is that of the carriages in the Phaedrus on the one hand and in the Katha Upanishad on the other hand. That is also Plato has analogies which are really very impressive. But Heraclitus, as such, can furnish us really very many elements of analogies between his philosophy and Indian philosophy. And in my opinion, Aurobindo has pointed out this very correctly. So I thank you very much, and well, it was really very brilliant, very interesting. Thank you.
Gracia, Gianluigi, thank you. Very quickly, Professor Chatukulam, please. Professor Jose Chatukulam. Okay, any other friend wishing to share thought? Dr. Mishra and Dr. Shia? Okay, if you are taking a bit of time, now let us listen to Richard's reflection on this very deep set of thoughts, please. Richard?
I really don't know where to begin. I don't know. I think we've said enough. Anyway, I'm very happy to see that my presentation has stimulated, seems to have stimulated everyone who has attended this talk, and we could go on indefinitely, but I think it's getting late here, and I think that's enough as far as I'm concerned.
So then thank you, Richard. Just in 1 or 2 minutes, as you felt that your presentation has stimulated, and not only your presentation, but your presence and presence of many co-seekers, Daniel, Ori, Benedetta, and Gyan, and especially some of these thoughts that they're really stimulating to think over, like logos and reason and Sri Aurobindo and Hegel. And today there is also deep reflections on limit of Hegelian ways. So in terms of time, therefore, transcultural philosophy is not just on the horizontal plane, but when we bring the temporal and hermeneutics, there is a very beautiful journey of what is called as multi-topial hermeneutics, building on the work of Raimundo Panikkar, who told about diatopial hermeneutics, meaning that as human beings we have 2 feet, and 1 feet in one culture and the other, but that is now being transformed into the multitopia. Similarly, we need to cultivate a multi-temporal hermeneutics. And that hermeneutics is not just limited to reading of text, but hermeneutics as a way of living. And that living and learning with different cultures and time, and therefore being with the past, present, and future, not being imprisoned by these, and then really playing with. And here, Ori's deep reflections about amoral is that with the amoral, there is also a challenge of sensitivity to suffering. And so, and possibly the study with the children, like the Piaget's, the moral development of the child, because in this playful world, still there is a little bit of sensitivity to what causes suffering. So that way, today the heavy burden that we have, suffering, war, and avoidable suffering. So with all these challenges and invitations, so we deeply thank Richard for your kind presence and generosity, and all friends co-present, Ori, Gyan Luigi, and Professor Chatukulam, Daniel, thanks for joining us with all these challenges, and all friends co-present. And we invite your kind interest and participation in our humble striving in this Vishwaneedam Center. We hold our dialogue every Sunday. So we look forward to your continuing presence and support. Thank you.